March 15, 1944. Ada Interception Station, north of Tokyo. Commander Atsuzo Kurihara was watching the last American transmission picked up in the Pacific, a sequence of sounds that made no sense to any of its 500 operators. For him, they were noises. To the U.S. Marines, they were combat orders. 3 years earlier, Kurihara had helped crack the Purple, the most complex diplomatic code in the United States. Now faced with a handful of incomprehensible words, his network of analysts was paralyzed. This paralysis was not a detail. It was the central thesis of Japan's failure. While the imperial doctrine bet on decoding as a strategic weapon, a group of invisible men transmitted thousands of messages by radio, without ever being understood. Japan did not know what it was hearing, and he would never find out. This documentary reveals the blind spot of Japanese intelligence in World War II, the existence of a code not generated by machines, but by memory, tradition, and indigenous culture. A communication system so ingenious that it could not be broken, because it did not follow any known logic. They were looking for figures. What they found was the voice of a people. But before we dive into the data, there's one statistic that defines this story better than any picture. Between 1942 and 1945, Japanese intelligence intercepted thousands of transmissions from the U.S. Marines and couldn't decipher a single one. No, not a word. There were more than 800 messages on Iwo Jima, dozens of battles in the Pacific, hundreds of hours of recordings analyzed with state-of-the-art equipment, linguists recruited from universities, and even Buddhist monks summoned to interpret the sounds. And yet, nothing. For 3 years, the Empire of the Rising Sun invested its greatest brains and technologies to understand a code that had been created by young people who, for the most part, were not even considered full citizens in the United States. If you value the story told accurately, detailed research, and facts that still amaze, consider leaving the like and subscribing. This helps this channel to keep alive the memory of everything they once tried to erase. Japanese intelligence entered World War II with the certainty that it would win with its ears. Long before Pearl Harbor, analysts from the Imperial Navy's Communications Department had broken the U.S. diplomatic code, the so-called Purple, a feat that impressed even the Axis allies. They knew in advance much of the diplomatic moves of the United States, and they trusted that this technical superiority would extend to the battlefield. At Ada, Japan's largest signal listening and analysis facility, 500 operators took turns in uninterrupted shifts. Each radio table was an invisible trench. More than 100 receivers swept the Pacific, picking up any frequency, any tone, any pattern. The technical apparatus was respectable. Phonetics analysts, experts in mathematical cryptography, linguists trained at Stanford, Oxford, and Tokyo, all gathered under the conviction that there was no message that could not be interpreted. Arrogance was embedded in the structure. Within 3 years, the Imperial Navy had decoded British, Australian, Dutch, and even U.S. Army operational protocols. They relied on rigid processes, frequency analyses, repetition rates, and tonal distribution. Each captured transmission was meticulously transcribed into wax cylinders, sent to laboratories and cross-referenced with files from more than 30 languages. And when war broke out in the Pacific, trust turned into doctrine. They believed that it only took time and effort to break any Allied code. The enemy for them was predictable. Their languages, known. Its logic, familiar. What they did not know, could not even conceive, was that they would soon face a linguistic structure that was not only unknown, but untranslatable. In the words of Lieutenant Kazuo Yamada, chief linguist of the Special Transmissions Sector, if there is structure, there is key. Human sound obeys rules. And where there are rules, there is rupture. The assumption seemed logical, but it would prove to be his downfall, because this logic ignored what the United States was quietly building. While Japan gathered linguists in laboratories, American naval intelligence recruited voices and trained them as weapons. The Japanese expected numerical figures, transposed figures, modular figures. What they received were metaphors, tones, phonemes that did not exist in any European language. And the cruelest thing, these messages passed through the open ether, under the eyes of the best specialists, and remained unintelligible. The Japanese machine was imposing, but it was prepared to face machines. What she found was something prior to logic, prior to the standard. He found a human code. By 1943, Japan had already decoded at least 7 Allied encryption systems. But that same year, internal reports began to emerge mentioning rhythmic, musical transmissions, with sound repetitions without semantic pattern. The term semantics was important. They couldn't attach meaning to words. Even though phonemes were repeated, their positions and constructions varied. And the most serious, there were no cultural references or recognizable grammatical structures. Atada sent 200 hours of recordings for phonetic analysis. Consultants from Kyoto Imperial University were called. They tested 17 language families. Nothing. A silent discomfort began to set in. The machines did not explain those voices. By contrast, on the other side of the Pacific, the United States was doing something that Japan would never understand. It was integrating culture, memory, and oral language into the war. Strategy was not in the hands of mathematicians but of invisible men, whose voices transformed tactical commands into pure, unintelligible, instantaneous sound. While Japan bet on statistics, the United States bet on human unpredictability, and they won. Here it is worth pausing for a fact that the Japanese never included in their equations. The industrial production of military radios in the United States between 1942 and 1944 was higher than that of the entire Axis combined. More than 2 million units, with transmission capacity in multiple frequencies. Comment there if this number surprises you. Use words like logistics wins, absolute power, or just unbelievable. This helps to show how much the war was won not only in weapons but in details. Japanese doctrine did not foresee this. It was based on the cultural superiority of the empire. They believed that they had mastered the field of language, of the mind, of abstraction. The Imperial Navy even installed floating antennas on ships to expand interception capacity in the South Pacific. But none of these innovations served in the face of a language that, for them, did not exist. Captain Yasuji Kawamoto would later write, "The code was transmitted so naturally that we thought for a long time that it was some form of Native American music with no operational function. We were deaf because we heard too much." The comment was symbolic and deeply ironic. Japan, so obsessed with listening, never heard what was really being said, and they were not alone. The Germans themselves, allies in the Axis, were warned by the Japanese about a possible tribal language in American broadcasts. Berlin's response was dry. If it's not a figure, it's not a threat. That phrase would be among the greatest errors of judgment in Axis intelligence, because what they disregarded was precisely what would defeat them, an ancestral voice, hidden within an industrial democracy, used as a cryptographic weapon. But the first time this code turned the tide of a battle was yet to come, and when it happened, it didn't involve tanks or planes. Only 2 voices, a transmitter, and 14 seconds of sound that Japan has never been able to understand. On March 15, 1944, at 0617 Japan Standard Time, the Ada listening station, located on the outskirts of Tokyo, recorded an unusual transmission. The frequency was American. The time pattern between transmissions corresponded exactly to what the Japanese had already cataloged as U.S. Marine Corps tactical communications. The duration of the message, the return interval, and even the response cadence of the receiver on the other end matched the typical behavior of a coordinated attack order. But there was a problem. No one understood a single word. The audio was immediately classified as Priority 1 and directed to the analysis centers in Tokyo, Yokosuka, and Sasebo. The analysts started with the standard technique, comparison with the files of known phonemes. Nothing. Then they applied tonal analysis. They identified a structure of high and low tones with seemingly patternless fluctuations. They tried to correlate with languages from Southeast Asia, without success. Finally, they turned to the oscilloscope, a device that converted sound into a graphic image, to try to extract some logical rhythm. The resulting graph looked like something musical, not a traditional cipher, but a sequence of linguistic elements with tonal variation, organic pauses and characteristics that suggested living language. One of the operators even described it as the voice of a shepherd talking to the wind. The perplexity increased in the following 48 hours. 7 other transmissions were captured with similar patterns, all related to tactical movements recorded shortly after by Japanese naval observers. American artillery, ship movements, deployment of infantry units. Each message seemed to have a direct, immediate, and lethal effect. The content was invisible, but the consequence was tangible. Japanese intelligence was faced with a paradox. A military communication whose existence was evident, but whose meaning was inaccessible. In an attempt to react, the Army Communications Department forwarded copies in wax cylinders to the Institute of Linguistics of the Imperial University of Tokyo. There, the teachers carried out a battery of comparative tests with more than 70 archived languages. They included Malay dialects, Filipino languages, Polynesian languages, and Austroasiatic variations. All results were negative. The phonetic pattern simply did not match any of the databases. By exclusion, it was hypothesized that it was a North American tribal language. But this hypothesis was considered implausible, an indigenous language being used as the military code in official Marine Corps broadcasts. For Japanese academics, it was inconceivable that the United States, a technological, modern, industrial country, would be using the language of shepherds and tribes to coordinate precision strikes. The analysis was archived, and the mistake deepened. The internal orders at the listening stations have shifted focus. Now any transmission that had the same sound characteristics, fluctuating tones, organic rhythm, absence of recognizable lexical patterns, was classified as a Type K anomaly. In the following weeks, the number of these anomalies grew exponentially. Saipan, Peleliu, Tinian, and Guam now have identical records. The reports became repetitive. Transmission received, tactical pattern identified, incomprehensible content. Lieutenant Shinjiro Hasegawa, an expert in spectrographic analysis, wrote in a confidential report, "The frequency is ours, the time is theirs, but the language seems otherworldly." Japanese intelligence was literally listening to the battlefield in real time, not understanding what was being said. Every attack order, every artillery coordinate, every American medical evacuation was transmitted with millimeter precision and total semantic invisibility. To deal with the impasse, the commander set up a special analysis cell in Okinawa, dedicated exclusively to Type K transmissions. Captain Masaru Fujimoto, in charge of the operation, implemented a reverse decoding model. Instead of trying to understand the content, he would seek to correlate time and effect. The messages were marked in real time and cross-referenced with tactical events reported by observers in the field. The hope was to detect temporal patterns that indicated specific functions, such as reinforcement calls or requesting air support. After 300 cross messages, a bitter conclusion emerged. The average time between transmission and the impact of the action was 90 to 120 seconds. To the Japanese, this meant only one thing. The Americans had real-time tactical communication, and she was inviolable. Frustration generated internal tension. Officials pressured analysts. Analysts blamed traitors. There were rumors of sabotage, technical failures, American espionage. One major even proposed that the signals were a distraction, sound psychological warfare. But the maps, with real craters and low counts, contradicted any conspiracy theory. The voices were real. The messages had an effect, and no one could translate them. Intellectual defeat was beginning to settle in the minds of the Japanese leadership. For the first time, it was questioned whether the enemy had crossed the barrier of decipherable logic. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Yamazaki was blunt in his report. "We are facing a type of code that does not follow any of the principles of the Western cipher. Maybe we shouldn't call it code. Maybe we should call it a language." But the recognition of the existence of the language did not mean access. There was no database, dictionaries, or reference documents. None of the speakers were known. No book had been published. It was, for all intents and purposes, an unregistered language, used as an invisible weapon in the age of military electronics. Japan, which had bet so much on mathematics, was now faced with a language outside the scope of equations. And the war continued. That same month, a new transmission arrived in the hands of Captain Kawashima. The recording was marked as Type K anomaly, critical level. The positioning of the American artillery at Tarawa depended on it. The sound was 14 seconds long. It was intercepted, recorded, analyzed, and classified as incomprehensible. Hours later, the American shells fell with millimeter accuracy, destroying a Japanese bunker before any warnings could be issued. The Imperial Navy realized that it was fighting with blindfolds on. and that each of those voices was, in fact, a tactical weapon of the highest level. But what they did not yet know, and were about to discover, is that these voices came from a people that the American government itself had tried to erase. Long before it was heard in military broadcasts, the language that would defeat Japanese intelligence had been nearly silenced within the United States itself. The Navajo language, with its dozens of tones, agglutinative verbs, and unique grammatical structures, was spoken by about 170,000 people in the early 1940s, most of them confined to the 27,000 square mile reservation in the American Southwest. For the federal government, it was just an indigenous dialect. For the educational system, it was a threat to assimilation. Navajo children who dared to speak their language in public schools or federal boarding schools were punished with corporal punishment, isolation, or public humiliation. In some institutions, the punishment included washing the mouth with soap and even whipping. The goal was clear: to erase the tongue, to even the mind. However, what the state classified as cultural backwardness hid a linguistic complexity that no military algorithm could understand. The Navajo was, by nature, inaccessible. The verbal structure allowed describing actions with temporal and dimensional nuances that did not exist in English. A verb could carry within itself time, intensity, location, and even the effective relationship of the subject with the object. A single word, for the Navajo, could be equivalent to an entire sentence for the military. This language, which seemed archaic in Washington's eyes, carried centuries of adaptation to orality, descriptive accuracy, and cultural resistance. It was then that Philip Johnston appeared. Born in 1892, the son of a Protestant missionary who lived among the Navajo for decades, Johnston was one of the few whites fluent in the language. He not only spoke, but understood the system of thought embedded in language. At the age of 9, he was already working as a translator for his father in religious services. At 15, he went to Washington to accompany Navajo delegations to political meetings. He was an American by birth, but with an inside view of a culture that his own country rejected. In December 1941, while reading about the Army's experimental use of Comanche speakers in training in Louisiana, Johnston saw more than a curiosity. He saw a strategic concept. As the war machine became increasingly reliant on mechanical codes, Johnston understood that the answer might lie in the mind, not in figures, but in culture. He then proposed something radical: to create a military code entirely based on the Navajo language, an oral, memorized, fast, and unbreakable system, not because it is too complex, but because it is too human. His proposal was met with skepticism. The U.S. military increasingly relied on equipment such as the M209 machine, which generated complex ciphers but required 30 minutes to transmit a tactical message. In contrast, Johnston ensured that trained speakers could transmit the same order in less than 20 seconds, with less chance of error and no risk of decipherable interception. On February 28, 1942, Johnston was allowed to make a demonstration at Camp Elliott in California. The test was decisive. 4 Navajo speakers transmitted and decoded operational messages with unprecedented speed and accuracy. General Clayton Vogel approved the pilot project, and 2 months later, on May 4th, the first 29 Navajo recruits were sworn in at Fort Wingate, New Mexico. None of them were fluent in technical English. None had operated a military radio, but they all had in their memory the language that their grandparents taught them, often in secret. The group included names that would later become silent legends: Chester Nez, Carl Gorman, Lloyd Oliver, John Brown, among others. Some had been to boarding schools where speaking Navajo was forbidden. Others lived as shepherds and had never left the reservation. Now, they were about to create an invisible military code. In a locked building under surveillance, they spent 8 weeks developing new terminologies for military terms that did not exist in their language. There was no word for tank, bomber, or aircraft carrier. They used visual and ancestral logic to reinvent the vocabulary: ironfish for submarine, war whale for battleship, hummingbird for light hunt, vulture for bomber. In addition, they created a phonetic alphabet where each letter of English had multiple equivalents in Navajo. For example, the letter A could be represented by words meaning ant, axe, or arm. This eliminated predictable patterns and frustrated any statistical analysis. Nothing was written, everything memorized. No manual could fall into enemy hands. The initial 211 terms were memorized, tested, and refined until the transmission occurred with millimeter precision. According to Chester Nez, a mistake could cost lives. In our culture, words have power. Speaking correctly was sacred. This moral conscience made the encoders more than transmitters. They were priests of war communication. With each message, they carried the weight of their culture and the responsibility of lives on the field. While European codes relied on gears, Navajo coders relied on memory, correct intonation, precise meaning, and connection to their ancestors. The contrast with what the Japanese expected could not be greater. They had trained their analysts to decipher Western patterns, Latin ciphers, Germanic ciphers, known phonetic approximations. They were prepared for mechanical complexity, but not for the oral simplicity that hid infinite layers of meaning. The same language that the American educational system had tried to destroy was now elevated to the status of a code of war. What had been classified as primitive was technologically superior to most available encryption machines, but the effectiveness of the code still needed to be tested in real combat. And that moment would soon come, not in a lab, but in a jungle, with tracer bullets streaking across the sky and the urgency of life depending on a single sentence spoken at the right time. It was on Guadalcanal that the code found its first litmus test, and there, in the midst of mud, death, and disorientation, what was once only indigenous theory would make obsolete everything that the Japanese called the science of listening. In May 1942, the first 29 Navajo recruits arrived at the Camp Pendleton Barracks in California. They did not bring manuals, diplomas, or military experience. They brought only the language of their ancestors and the responsibility of creating from scratch a coding system that could operate under the fire of war. The proposal was audacious: to transform an ancient language, without a standardized alphabet, into a military tool capable of transmitting complex orders with speed, security, and absolute reliability. The project was immediately placed under seal. No written material would be produced. No dictionary, no table, no physical record. Everything should be created and memorized. The first step involved the creative translation of military concepts that simply did not exist in the Navajo vocabulary. For tanks, they created che-da-gahi, literally, armored turtle. Submarine became besh-lo, iron fish. Aircraft carrier became tsidi-nildo, carrier bird. Bomber, jay-sho, vulture in flight. Each metaphor was intuitive to the speakers, but airtight to any outside listener. Communication began to operate not only outside Western logic, but on a linguistic plane that no machine would decipher. The second challenge was to structure an operational phonetic alphabet. Knowing that statistical analysis was one of the main weapons of enemy cryptanalysts, coders developed multiple words for each letter, alternating their use randomly. The letter A, for example, could be represented by wola-chi, ant, bela-sana, apple, or tsi-nil, axe. This destroyed any frequency pattern. The Japanese could even intercept sound repetitions, but they could never map their correspondence. This strategy was especially effective against automatic methods of analysis that sought to predict meanings based on repetitions. The coders had created dynamic, unpredictable, and self-correcting code. The structure of the code grew in complexity, but its essence remained in orality. Everything was trained intensively. The 29 took turns in pairs, testing speed of response, clarity of intonation, and consistency under pressure. In a short time, they were able to transmit entire messages in 20 seconds, a feat unattainable for any encryption equipment at the time. The M209 machine, for example, required more than 30 minutes to encrypt and decipher similar orders, and it still depended on experienced operators and electric power. The Navajo code worked in voice, in heat, in clay, in rain, explosion, and death. It was a weapon that didn't jam, didn't break, didn't need maintenance, just memory and discipline. More than efficiency, there was confidence. The link between coders and tactical commands was so direct that critical decisions were often made based on oral transmissions without conference. The radio operators knew, if the message came in Navajo, it was legitimate. There was no way to forge, imitate, or falsify that sequence of sounds. Navajo phonology included features that were non-existent in Japanese or German, such as glottal sounds, ejective consonants, and vocal tones that varied the meaning of the word based on intonation. To a non-native listener, the language seemed like a hum interspersed with anarchic pops, breaths, and pauses. For the coders, it was living mathematics. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. A language that the United States itself had tried to erase now became its most sophisticated advantage. If you are enjoying unraveling these facts hidden under layers of time and neglect, show your support. Like this video and subscribe. It helps us to keep telling stories that history has tried to bury. As the war progressed, the code evolved. New technologies required new metaphors. Jet planes have been dubbed birds that burn the air. Chemical weapons have become poisonous wind. The atomic bomb, until then secret, was called the metal egg. And all these adaptations were made collectively, based on linguistic consensus, semantic clarity, and tactical adequacy. There were no experts, only speakers. Each one brought their experiences and built based on oral tradition. The result was a code so ingrained in the identity of the speakers that it was impossible to betray. A traitor would have to first betray himself. Meanwhile, in the silent corridors of Tokyo, Imperial Navy analysts continued to treat these transmissions as sound anomalies. They gathered recordings, applied filters, resorted to linguistic databases of allied universities, ending in failure. The only certainty was that wherever these messages emerged, American troops moved with an inexplicable tactical advantage. It was like fighting an enemy who anticipated every action, but whose words could never be intercepted. But none of this had yet been tested under real fire. The training was promising, the initial results surprising, but the war required proof. And the first would come in the heart of the Pacific, on an island shrouded in fever, mud, and ambushes. Guadalcanal was not a testing ground. It was a killing field. And it would be there, in absolute chaos, that the spoken code would show its true nature, not as a hypothesis, but as a tool for survival. In August 1942, the first Navajo coders were sent to the Pacific with the 1st Marine Division. The destination was Guadalcanal, a strategic point whose possession meant control of maritime supply lines in the South Pacific. For the Japanese, the attack was predictable. Their listening stations had intercepted conventional transmissions weeks earlier and, as usual, set up defensive positions in the most likely landing areas. Japanese doctrine still believed that intelligence would win over muscle. But on August 7th, when American ships approached the island and the radios began to crackle with commands, something broke the expectation. The communication pattern abruptly changed. The orders that had previously been coded in English, with an expected structure, began to be transmitted in a sound sequence that did not fit into any known language. Japanese operators classified the change as an electronic warfare anomaly, assuming it was some new sound disguise technology. It wasn't. It was Chester Nez, Navajo coder, transmitting the first artillery orders with absolute accuracy. In a matter of seconds, the coordinates of a Japanese machine gun nest were passed on to the American command. The answer came with naval artillery, which destroyed the position with two 127mm rounds. To Japanese observers, the reaction seemed magical. No decipherment time, no operational pause. The command had been given, received, and carried out, without a single word having been understood by the enemy. During the following fights, this pattern was repeated. The Japanese, accustomed to anticipating movements based on intercepted communications, suddenly found themselves blinded. The Imperial Navy did not understand what it was hearing, and, even more serious, he could not respond with the same agility. The encoder's radios operated on open frequency. There was no need to hide the transmission. The secret was not in the sign, but in the form. What the Japanese captured was, for them, a flow of dissonant sounds, without logic. But for Americans, each syllable carried direction, distance, intensity, and maneuvering sequence. During the 6-month campaign on Guadalcanal, Navajo coders transmitted hundreds of messages, none of which were deciphered, delayed, or compromised. On one occasion, the Japanese managed to intercept a complete communication, 18 seconds of continuous audio. They analyzed it for weeks. They concluded that it was a ritual recording, some kind of indigenous ceremonial song. The actual content? An urgent request for 60mm ammunition to a forward position. The American response came in less than 3 minutes, saving an entire company. Meanwhile, Axis operators began to report inconsistencies in intelligence reports. Attack predictions based on wiretaps were increasingly inaccurate. The Japanese army, which relied on the Navy's analysis to move its troops, began to question the validity of the interceptions. In a confidential memorandum of September 1942, Colonel Haruo Konuma wrote, "There is something new in American communications. It is not a cipher, it is language, but one we don't recognize." The Japanese listening machine, until then proudly effective, had been overtaken by a handful of young people, who until a few years earlier did not even have the legal right to vote in the United States. In practical terms, the impact was devastating. The accuracy of the transmissions drastically reduced the response time of the American artillery. Orders that previously took 15 to 30 minutes between encoding, sending, receiving, and decoding now took less than 30 seconds between request and impact. In jungle warfare, where positions changed rapidly and ambushes were frequent, this agility was lethal. Japanese logistics, based on anticipation, collapsed operationally. The entire structure of predictability, previously fed by an efficient decipherment chain, has been neutralized. And as the fighting progressed, Japanese field reports began to omit direct references to enemy communications. It was the implicit acknowledgement of defeat. The war was being fought not only with tanks and rifles, but with voices, and the voices were winning. Coders also adapted quickly to the field. They learned to operate under fire, transmitting with gas masks in flooded trenches, with explosions around and with no margin for error. The training at Camp Pendleton had taught more than phonetics. It had molded soldiers capable of translating chaos into command. On Guadalcanal, this capability has been tried and true. The code didn't just resist. It worked with efficiency superior to that of any machine at the time. Japanese intelligence, for its part, has stepped up its attempts to make sense of the new messages. He sent recordings for analysis at universities, summoned monks who were experts in Sanskrit, and linguists trained in Germany. The answer was unanimous. There is no basis for comparison. A professor at Kyoto University summed it up accurately. The language used does not belong to the domain of Western science. It carries elements that escape the logic of classification. It was a confession of impotence, and the first of many to come. But Guadalcanal was just the beginning. The real test of the code would still come in more intense battles, with greater technological presence and tactical demands. The next American campaign would put coders at the center of an all-out logistical war, where every second counted, and where the failure of a message could mean hundreds of deaths. It was in this new phase that the Japanese decided to react, and his answer would come in the most brutal form possible, trying to turn a prisoner of war into a weapon of decipherment. In April 1942, in the early months of the American offensive in the Philippines, a young Navajo soldier named Joe Kailumia was captured by Japanese forces during the surrender of Bataan. For the Japanese, it represented a rare opportunity. A native speaker of the language who was beginning to appear with increasing frequency in the radio broadcasts of the U.S. Marines, and who remained absolutely impenetrable to his analysts. Kailumia was not a trained coder. He was not part of the secret group that had created the code, nor had he been exposed to encrypted message procedures. But that mattered little to his interrogators. The mere fact that he was Navajo made him, in the eyes of Japanese intelligence officers, the key to deciphering the enigma that corroded his tactical analyses. Transferred to an interrogation center in Auna, Kailumia was subjected to long sessions of forced wiretapping. The Japanese played back to him recordings of actual transmissions made by coders on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, waiting for the soldier to recognize the terms and translate them. But what Kailumia heard made no sense. He understood the words, turtle, ironfish, hummingbird, eggs, but he could not give them any military meaning. They were metaphors of the code names that only those who knew the system developed at Camp Elliott could interpret correctly. To him, the phrases sounded like poetic absurdities. The turtle is attacking the iron fish. The hummingbird carries eggs. The interrogators did not accept this explanation. They accused him of hiding the truth. The reasoning was simple and uncompromising. If the language was Navajo, a Navajo had to understand it. When the translations did not come, the punishments began. Torture with water, beatings, suspension by the arms for hours. During the winter of 1943, Joe was left naked on the snow. his feet freezing on the ground until they merged with the ice sheet. With each refusal, the violence increased. With each sincere answer, "I don't understand what they're saying," the officers convinced themselves that he was lying. They offered food in exchange for a simple translation. They promised freedom if he deciphered a message. Joe still had no answers, because there were no answers he could give. The Japanese did not understand what they were facing. They had broken complex codes such as purple, thanks to mathematical reasoning, frequency analysis, and knowledge of patterns. But now they were faced with something radically different. A code with no written record, no statistical logic based on knowledge transmitted orally and memorized by a restricted group. It was more theater than cipher, more culture than formula. Joe Kalumia, with all his command of the Navajo language, could never translate a system he had never been taught. And this simple detail, that the language was only the medium, not the secret, completely dismantled the Japanese logic of deciphering. In May 1943, an internal Japanese intelligence report, now declassified, sums up the frustration. The prisoner appears native to the intercepted language but does not understand the content of the messages. Evaluation: extraordinary endurance or use of specialized code based on native language that requires specific training. The conclusion is revealing. For the first time, Japan admitted, albeit with reservations, that there was a factor beyond language, a level of encoding embedded within speech itself, impossible to penetrate through traditional methods. What was initially seen as a primitive language of low sophistication now revealed itself as one of the most complex forms of military security ever used in history. The Kalumia case is more than a tragic anecdote. It represents the collapse of an entire doctrine, the belief that every human message, no matter how obscure it may seem, can be deciphered with the right resources, has given way to the recognition that there are barriers that go beyond the realms of science. Navajo oral culture, shaped by centuries of exclusion, punishment, and resistance, had spawned a system of communication that no algorithm could decipher, not because it is superior in logical terms, but because it is beyond the reach of Western logic. Kalumia survived captivity. He spent more than 3 years in prison, returning to the United States only after the end of the war. He never received training as a coder. He never understood what made him be tortured for so long. To the American military, he was a survivor. For the Japanese, a failed enigma. For history, a living witness of what separates language from code and culture from machine. The Kalumia case standoff was, for Japanese intelligence, a turning point. From the second half of 1943, the 4th section of the Imperial Navy began to redirect its resources. New analysts were assigned exclusively to study these ritualized transmissions. A group of experts in Native American languages was assembled, although without much success, and attempts to cooperate with German intelligence began to be explored, in a last hope that, on the other side of the world, someone might have the key to deciphering the indecipherable. But this search was doomed from the start, because the code was not German, Japanese, or American. He was Navajo, and because of that, he was human on a level that no machine could reproduce. In the corridors of Tokyo, frustration began to turn to despair. The reports began to change tone. The words unbreakable, utterly strange, and unprecedented have come up frequently. The silence of military logic gave way to the humility of impotence. And while Japanese analysts wasted nights trying to decipher a language they didn't understand, the code talkers continued to advance with the Marines across the Pacific. Saipan, Tarawa, Peleliu. In each battle, more messages, more successful operations, more orders transmitted in seconds and executed with deadly accuracy. The code worked, and the men who wore it were now trained not only to pass it on, but to defend it with their lives. The Japanese realized too late that capturing a broadcast was not enough. It was necessary to capture an encoder, entire and alive. And it was precisely this new strategy that, from 1944 onwards, would become the absolute priority of the empire's intelligence. By mid-1944, Japanese naval intelligence had already allocated its best resources to a single mission, deciphering the transmissions that, day after day, coordinated the operations of the American Marines. The effort was colossal. 30 specialists from the 4th section of the Imperial Navy, including veteran cryptographers, academic linguists, and sound technicians, were assigned exclusively to indecipherable tonal transmissions, as they came to be called. It was essentially a war against the wind. They listened, analyzed, and tested sounds that sounded human, but refused to obey any mechanical logic. They developed equipment capable of slowing down the recordings without tonal distortion to try to analyze the musicality of speech. They used oscilloscopes to visually trace phonetic patterns. They sought relationships with shamanic chants from Southeast Asia, Polynesian dialects, and even the sounds of local birds. They called Buddhist monks versed in ancient languages, who had studied Sanskrit and Tibetan. No progress. The words, although repeated in different messages, did not form statistical patterns. What seemed like verbal logic dissolved in the absence of any known grammar. In one of the most audacious attempts, Captain Yoshiro Tanaka proposed a reverse phonetic approach: record thousands of transmissions, isolate the syllables, and try to group them by frequency of use. The idea was to build a basic vocabulary, assuming that military codes required repetition. There were 200 hours of recordings on wax cylinders, examined with surgical attention. However, each attempt to construct a lexicon failed at the same point. The system adapted. The coders alternated words, exchanged metaphors, and deliberately avoided repeating the same signs for the same concept. It was too flexible an architecture to be frozen in formulas. And then came the eye-opening moment, the discovery that it was a Native American language, a bold hypothesis that arose from the tonal analysis of a young lieutenant, Masaru Yamada, who had studied music in the United States. For him, the high and low tones resembled a tonal language, something similar to Vietnamese or Cantonese, but with its own patterns. Crossing recordings with records of native languages, Yamada suggested that the source could be Navajo. This identification generated hope. The Japanese quickly sent requests for cooperation to German intelligence, hoping that ethnographic archives or language recordings made by missionaries could help. But the effort ran into a lack of material. Unlike other indigenous languages, Navajo was oral. There were no extensive dictionaries. Few non-natives spoke it, and even fewer were willing to teach him. Even in the face of this partial discovery, the Japanese still did not decipher a single message, because now they understood what they were facing: a living language rooted in millennia of oral culture, turned into code by men who refused any written record. It was impossible to reproduce the exact sound without training. Each syllable depended on intonation, rhythm, and context. The slightest variation, something common among non-native speakers, completely altered the meaning. This rendered ineffective attempts at vocal mimicry conducted by Japanese operators. They recorded the broadcasts and tried to repeat them, word for word, to deceive American interlocutors. But trained coders immediately noticed the fraud. The answers ceased. The broadcasts changed channels. An interception section report dated November 1944 admits, "Vocal imitation has failed because of an inability to reproduce the specific tones and phonemes of the source. Even repeated broadcasts sound different. The language is organic." It is at this point that frustration turns into impotence. The Japanese machine, which had cracked the purple code, deciphered British naval communications, and exploited vulnerabilities in Russian ciphers, now found itself defeated by human voices. Pastors, students, young people who had grown up on reservations in New Mexico and Arizona now operated systems more effective than any encryption machine. And here's the ironic statistic. While Japan had 30 experts dedicated to the mission of breaking the Navajo code, the United States had already trained more than 400 coders, operating on all fronts of the Pacific. On average, each Navajo broadcast was completed in 20 seconds. The same content, transmitted by M209 machine, would take 30 minutes, a time difference that, in combat, separates life from death. The difference between holding a position or losing it under enemy fire. If this scale surprises you, leave a short phrase in the comments: absolute power or simply shocking data, because that's exactly what it was. A logistical discrepancy the Japanese could never match. Imperial intelligence leaders began to recognize the tactical problem. Lieutenant Commander Shigeru Fukumoto wrote in his diary, "The enemy speaks like wind among stones. We cannot imprison his words. They flow. We just listened." The analogy, although poetic, reflects the failure of the Japanese rational structure in the face of a system that did not obey binary logic, nor the statistics of symbols. The Navajo code was not conventional cryptography. It was cultural performance elevated to the maximum degree of military sophistication, something that no Japanese university, no matter how advanced in engineering, could replicate. And it was from this point that the Japanese strategy changed. If they could not decipher the messages, they would try to silence the voices. Coders have become priority targets. Orders were issued to capture at least one of them alive, with full equipment. Rewards of up to 10,000 yen, the equivalent of 10 years' salary, were offered to any soldier who achieved such a feat. But the problem was that coders trained for it. They were instructed to destroy equipment at any sign of capture. They had clear orders never to surrender with materials in hand. And the very structure of the team, always in pairs with dedicated protection, made the mission almost suicidal for any attacker. Even with all these measures, the Japanese kept trying. They invested in visual phonetic translations, analyzed pause patterns, compared recordings with Cherokee and Comanche dialects, believing that perhaps there was a mixture of languages. Nothing worked, because the very logic of the code was mutant, adaptive, and profoundly human. And meanwhile, the coders kept moving forward. In Saipan, in Peleliu, in Tarawa, their voices pierced the chaos of war with the precision of a scalpel. They transmitted enemy positions, evacuation requests, naval fire coordinates, all in seconds, all without error, and all without ever being understood by the enemy. But the real test would come soon, a place where broadcasts would be incessant, total chaos and precision a matter of survival. A place that would require the utmost of mind, courage, and code. Your name? Iwo Jima. At dawn on February 19, 1945, the black sand of Iwo Jima began to shake under the roar of 450 American battleships. For 3 days, the bombardment had hammered the island with more than 8,000 tons of ammunition, preparing the ground for the landing of the 5th Marine Division. But beneath the surface, sheltered by a network of tunnels and fortified caves, Japanese General Tadamichi Kuribayashi waited. He knew American doctrine. He knew how to predict formations, recognize signs, anticipate patterns, and in the first few minutes of the invasion, he believed that his strategy of staggered defense in depth would succeed. But what Kuribayashi didn't know was that, at that very moment, 6 young Navajo, stationed at different points on the front lines, were already transmitting the orders that would reorganize the American battlefield with lethal precision. In just 48 hours, the encoders sent more than 800 messages, none intercepted, none delayed, none errored. Transmissions crisscrossed the island like invisible command circuits, guiding platoons, calling for reinforcements, adjusting airstrikes, canceling impending bombardments on positions already conquered. In one of the most critical episodes, a surrounded unit in the northern sector urgently requested cover fire. The request, transmitted by an encoder under direct fire, was processed and executed in less than 3 minutes. The enemy, who were preparing for a counterattack, were pulverized by naval artillery before leaving the position. Kuribayashi, considered one of the smartest commanders of the Pacific War, faced a new kind of darkness. Its observers recorded American movements, but the reports did not match the expected patterns. Troops appeared where they shouldn't be. Artillery responded to attacks even before positions were detected. In an internal report, his assistant, Major Tomokazu Nagano, wrote, "The enemy responds with a speed that we cannot explain. It's as if they see beyond their natural reach." The frustration was visible. The Japanese did not understand how the Americans could coordinate offensives amid the confusion of the landings, with fragmented lines and hand-to-hand fighting in all sectors. They did not know that the orders came in a low voice, in an ancestral language, transmitted from man to man, without a radio coder, without paper, without delay. The sophistication of the Navajo code reached its apex on Iwo Jima, not only for the speed and efficiency but for the physical and mental endurance of the coders. Under constant bombardment, buried by explosions, facing extreme exhaustion, they continued to operate without pause. The broadcasts were short, precise, and filled with coded technical vocabulary. Each coder knew more than 600 terms by heart, many with 3 or more alternatives, and could translate complex orders in less than 20 seconds. The command of an airstrike involving 3 points of impact, for example, took less than a minute to transmit, verify, and execute. The tactical impact was unparalleled. At dawn on the third day, when the Americans had already consolidated part of the beach, Kuribayashi ordered a coordinated counterattack from the caves of Mount Suribachi. The maneuver was anticipated by a wiretap by American scouts, and in a matter of seconds, a coder transmitted the coordinates to the USS Nevada's gunners. 3 salvos were enough to crush the advance before it began. The broadcast lasted 18 seconds. Once again, the Japanese were blinded by the action. The psychological effect of this invisibility was devastating. Kuribayashi's soldiers began to report that American weapons responded to thought, that their positions were destroyed before they could even react. And the general, with all the maps and plans in hand, realized that something out of his reach had taken control of the battle. He had prepared for trench warfare, of dogged resistance, of force against force. But now he was fighting against a language he could not capture, against orders he could not intercept, against an enemy who heard everything and said nothing. On February 26th, a new report was sent to Tokyo. In it, an analyst of the Japanese communications sector reported, "All attempts to intercept American orders have failed. The broadcasts feature unmatched vocal elements in known languages. We conclude that the structure is alive, based on a non-repetitive system, and immune to decoding." It was the final confirmation of a total technical failure. And meanwhile, in the American countryside, the logistics machine operated like never before. Helicopters brought supplies, radios worked in redundancy, and coders maintained the backbone of coordination. At the end of the battle, General Howard Connor, communications officer for the 5th Division, declared, "If it weren't for the Navajo code talkers, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima." A direct statement, without flourishes. And true. The irony was total. Japan, with its tradition of naval intelligence, its obsession with codes, and its record of successes in deciphering, was being defeated by indigenous voices, by a language that its analysts did not even recognize as a formal language. There was no machine. There was no algorithm. Just young people who spoke like their grandparents, now connecting ships, planes, and soldiers under the most intense fire of the war. But the impact of the code would not stop at Iwo Jima. Their presence would be even more crucial in the next battle, where the scale of the conflict would surpass any precedent. Okinawa, the last rung before mainland Japan, where coders would be pushed to the limit, transmitting amid 180,000 troops and 2,300 ships, and where the very fate of the war would be, once again, on the tip of the tongue. From the second half of 1944, something changed in the reports of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Until then, even in the face of mounting losses, analysts still held the belief that the doctrine of interception and decryption was effective. But suddenly, the predictions failed. American landings took place in unanticipated locations, reinforcements arrived earlier than expected, and attacks came from directions that were not on probability maps. The reconnaissance divisions began to issue vague warnings. Anomalous activity detected. Naval presence with no approach logic. But the truth was harsher. Japanese intelligence had lost its main weapon, the ability to see the enemy's steps before they were taken. The Navajo Code, now fully integrated into operations, created an invisible wall between American decision and Japanese perception. The orders flowed with total precision, but their origin and content remained sealed, as if the Americans were operating in a parallel dimension. In September, a report by the 4th Naval Section admitted, "The previous predictability of enemy attacks has been completely suppressed. No recent operation could be anticipated by means of interception." It was the beginning of the silent panic. The Admiralty began operating with an unprecedented margin of error. Naval movements began to be conducted blindly, based more on assumptions than data. The combined fleet, accustomed to maneuvering with mathematical precision, now sailed under constant pressure, and increasingly, under fire. Air patrols, once coordinated to react to deciphered signals, now rely on direct visual surveillance. War returned to instinct. And instinct, in the face of the American logistics machine, was an ineffective luxury. The irony did not escape analysts. In an internal note, Commander Juro Tanabe recorded, What we once called tribal noise has now proven more effective than our network of stations. We lost the sound, and with it, the light. Japanese superiority in interception, earned with discipline, study, and technology, was now obsolete in the face of human, secretly trained voices shaped by a culture that the Americans themselves had tried to erase. It was, literally, the revenge of a marginalized language. What's more, it was the demonstration that control of the radio spectrum, once dominated by machines and mathematicians, now belonged to a handful of young people with names like Nez, Yazi, and Bigay. In Okinawa, this strategic blindness would reach its apex. There, the Japanese could not even predict the exact day of the landing. The fleet was positioned in the opposite direction. The reinforcement came late, and the resistance, though fierce, was ineffective. In the final report of the island's defense, there is a phrase that sums up the new state of mind of the High Command. We are deaf, and now, we are also mute. But not all eyes were closed. On the mainland, a German intelligence officer was closely watching anomalies in Japanese behavior, and he was about to identify the missing link, the piece that escaped all calculations. In March 1945, Tokyo ordered an emergency movement that involved the country's three largest universities. Kyoto, Tokyo, and Keio were quietly called upon to provide linguists, phoneticians, anthropologists, and tonal structure experts to attempt the impossible, to decipher the voices that crossed the Pacific carrying American orders. A special committee was set up within the Institute of Asian Studies, whose aim was to review the recordings collected over the past 2 years by listening stations in Saipan, Truk, and Palau. For the first time, the Japanese academic elite was mobilized directly for the war of signals, and what they found was not a language, but a spectrum, voices that changed pitch, structures that dissolved when repeated, meanings that were inverted according to the context. It was a living language, yes, but above all it was a living code. For each term identified, 3 variations emerged. For each pattern sketched, a new exception emerged. What seemed to be animal names in some messages became verbs, in others locations. There was no stable root. There was no mathematical logic. The team of Professor Ichiro Kameda, an expert in Austroasiatic languages, tried to apply tonal analysis models based on Himalayan languages. Failed. The phonetics group proposed a rhythmic analysis inspired by African drum patterns, another flaw. They even tried to segment syllables and assemble blocks of meaning, but the finding was always the same. For each attempt at approximation, the code seemed to escape one step ahead. More than 200 hours of recordings were phonetically transcribed into Japanese characters, but the result was illegible even to the analysts themselves. Sound did not translate into form. Form did not reveal function. And the function, once determined, did not repeat itself. The words changed every day. Not only because of the improvisation of the operators, but because of a more perplexing factor, continuous updating. The code, like an organism, adapted in real time. The Navajos trained new variations, introduced new terms, and avoided any routine. It was the opposite of what the Japanese knew, an antithesis of traditional cryptography, which relied on repetition and recognition. Frustration spread like a virus through the analysis tables. At Keio University's engineering laboratory, a group has even designed a device to slow down transmissions and isolate vowel pulses in real time. Preliminary tests produced only incoherent images, lines that oscillated without a pattern. The final report, signed by Chief Technician Norio Matsuda, was laconic. There is no stability. The sound seems to obey a non-technical logic. It was then that amid the growing tension, the Japanese began to test an even more desperate hypothesis, that the code was not just linguistic, but cultural, that its true strength was not in the phonetic construction, but in the impossibility of separating it from the mind that issued it. The concept was new, almost philosophical. The Navajo code could not be reproduced because its root was not written down, nor taught in the classroom. It was inherited, shaped by experience, tradition, and deep orality. It was not a manual that any soldier could read. It was necessary to live that language, to speak, to breathe, to think like a Navajo, to even begin to understand it. And even then, without specific military training, it would be useless. It was this conclusion that led Lieutenant Masaru Yamada to declare, in a classified letter, "Even if we capture a speaker, we are in the dark. Because the key is not the language, it is the system that the language houses. A language within a language." In practice, what this meant was even more humiliating. The Japanese were facing a type of encryption that could not be replicated, predicted, or quantified. There was no formula to be applied, nor technology to be improved, and the closer they got to the structure of the code, the more it dissolved into abstraction. It was like trying to hold the wind with your hands. The Imperial Navy, which for years had prided itself on its technical prowess, now saw its electronic warfare doctrine collapse in the face of what it had once considered folklore. Gradually, the language of failure began to appear in the memos. Inaccessible, theoretical insufficiency, methodological failure have become recurrent expressions. A final report sent to General Headquarters in July 1945 contained the phrase that would later be used as an epitaph for Japanese intelligence in the Pacific War. No tool of Western thought seems adequate to penetrate the system used by the Americans. The code is not technical, it's human, and that's why it's absolute. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the coders continued to transmit. In Okinawa, in Guam, in Luzon, and at the end of each battle, a new cycle of updates was started. New terms, renewed memberships, memorized instructions. The code evolved, and with it, the abyss. But there was still a last breath of hope. On the European front, a group of cryptanalysts from the Abwehr, German military intelligence, had intercepted a sequence of Allied transmissions in the ports of Marseille. At first, they seemed like ordinary voices, but the pause pattern, nasal tone, and unrecognized structure drew attention. They were voices coming from the other side of the world, and that's when the Germans asked a simple question, but one that would change everything. What is this that the Japanese are hearing but not understanding? While the Japanese obsessively searched for patterns, repetition, and codes that could be broken, the United States built a war structure that depended not on predictability, but on abundance. The logic of the Imperial Navy was clear. Control of information generates advantage. But the Americans knew that in the long run, control would be overcome by scale. While Japanese analysts operated stations in grueling shifts, trying to decipher every fragment of conversation, the United States trained, in parallel, hundreds of new Navajo coders, trained not only to speak but to adapt language to the speed of the field. It was the difference between operating a Swiss watch and running a power plant. One was precise, the other, unstoppable. The American strategy was holistic. Instead of focusing efforts solely on mathematical cryptography, they invested in human diversity. Hundreds of immigrants and ethnic groups have been incorporated into the intelligence, communications, and electronic warfare cadres. There were anti-Nazi Germans on the OSS, Japanese Americans on the European front, and natives practicing broadcasts on the Arizona reservations. At Camp Pendleton, the command understood that what Japan considered linguistically useless was in fact the missing link of a modern warfare doctrine. The Navajo Code was the most visible example, but it was not the only one. The American effort started from a base that the enemy could not replicate, an industrially decentralized, technologically expansive, and culturally heterogeneous society. While Japan centralized power in closed circles of officers, the U.S. opened channels, literally, to all possible talent. This is where the comparison becomes brutal. By 1944, while Japan had some 30,000 communication specialists working in high-security environments, the United States had surpassed 200,000 operators trained in radio systems, encryption, and tactical coding, many of them coming from completely different backgrounds. And not only that, while the Japanese had only 2 major universities linked to the war effort in communications, the U.S. had more than 40 university institutions, including Harvard, MIT, and Berkeley, working together with military departments. The mathematics of war was not just about armored vehicles and ships, it was brains. Pause for the fact that few historians cite. In 1945, the United States produced, per month, more than 11,000 military field radios. Japan, with all its limited resources, could not reach 1,000. The advantage was not only in quality, it was impossible to keep up with the volume. The Americans didn't need to hide all their signs. They just had to make sure that the only one that was really vital was indecipherable. And he was. If you found this difference in scale unbelievable, comment with the phrase, "Logistics wins." While the Japanese looked for patterns in the sound, the Americans created new words to deviate the patterns. By the time the Japanese analysts mapped out 5 possible translations, the coders had already changed the terms. When they identified a repetition, it was replaced. When they thought they had found a structure, they discovered that it was just another layer. The genius was not only in the code, but in the doctrine behind the code: continuous adaptation, decentralization of knowledge, and complete trust in the soldier. Each Navajo operator was an autonomous cell. None carried papers. None recorded his messages. None could deliver the complete structure because it didn't exist anywhere. It existed only in motion. This was the invisible cog in a colossal machine. American power in World War II was not limited to the 276,000 planes built, the 2,710 Liberty ships launched, or the 40 billion bullets produced. It also lay in how the country was able to turn marginalized culture into a strategic weapon. And in this, Japan and Germany have completely failed. Japanese doctrine saw the world through a rigid, classificatory lens. Communication was a technical field for elite specialists. The United States had already understood that, in the 20th century, total war meant total mobilization. Nothing was disposable. No culture was useless. No voice was irrelevant. This systemic vision, combined with logistical capacity, created a war where the codes were human, the networks were alive, and the response was always faster than the analysis. For each new Japanese method of listening, a new American variation emerged. For each interception attempt, a new layer of oral secrecy. The Navajo code, in this context, was not an isolated miracle. It was a direct consequence of a structure that Japan could not see, and because of that, it never managed to win. But this blindness was not restricted to the Pacific. On the other side of the world, Germany was watching with concern the American advances, especially after the Normandy landings. There too something seemed to escape logic. Troops moved in perfect sync, reinforcements arrived with almost absurd punctuality, and transmissions, even when intercepted, revealed nothing. That's when a Wehrmacht colonel asked an awkward question. What if Americans are using voices as code? The answer would come quickly, and it would bear the stamp of a truth that the German war machine had also ignored. For Japanese and German signals engineers, the war was an equation, a flow of controllable variables, where each transmission could be reduced to patterns, where each repetition suggested a logic, and each silence had a calculable meaning. Since the beginning of World War II, the Axis empires have bet heavily on electronic engineering and mathematics applied to interception warfare. The machine was the extension of the mind, and the mind in turn should dominate the invisible: waves, codes, frequencies. In this scenario, the Navajo code didn't make sense. It did not belong to the logical universe, nor did it obey the principles of classical cryptography. He was not a system. It was a living language. This was the conceptual turn that no Japanese officer was prepared to face, and that began to silently bother the Germans as well. The Abwehr reports indicated American broadcasts picked up in North Africa and later in Marseille contained unusual sound structures. They were not telegraphed pulses. They were not figures. They were voices, but voices that did not obey the cadence of English, nor the rhythmic pattern of any European language. They were paused, tonal, endowed with a strange musicality, and yet too organized to be casual. It was Lieutenant Otto Hollenstein, an Austrian phonetician, who raised the hypothesis. We are dealing with an indigenous language, maybe something undocumented. The assumption was shelved. No one in the high command wanted to believe that the Americans, owners of the largest arms industry in history, were using as a weapon a culture that did not even appear in the official books. The mistake was philosophical. While Japanese engineers built decoding devices based on Cartesian logic, Navajo coders improvised organic solutions based on context. To a Japanese operator, the repetition of a term should mean the same concept in different messages. For a Navajo operator, repetition was the danger, so they used multiple terms for the same lyrics, avoided duplicate sounds, and adapted their associations according to the weather, terrain, or even the time of day. The code moved. He breathed with his surroundings, and for that he could not be imprisoned. The ancient language of the Dene, as the Navajos call themselves, has been shaped for centuries to describe the invisible: wind, spirit, mountain, silence. It was not born from the need to register, but from the collective experience with the world. It was not analytical, it was symbolic, and for this very reason, when adapted for military purposes, it became an instrument impossible to break, because the essence of the code was not only in the sound, but in the intention of the sound. The same term, such as turtle, used for tanks, could have three distinct meanings depending on tone, context, and operator. This required not only memorization, but cultural mastery. No foreigner, no matter how trained, would be able to replicate this without living that worldview. Japan, a master of technological imitation, tried to simulate. He created recordings, trained actors, copied phonemes, but he did not understand that he was fighting against something that transcends mechanics: language as identity. When the Navajos delivered a message, they weren't just talking, they were invoking a millennia-old heritage. Each operator had a repertoire in his voice that the Japanese tried to calculate with oscilloscopes. It was like trying to measure temperature with a stopwatch. This chasm between paradigms was documented in silence. The classified report of the Japanese Naval Intelligence Center, dated August 1945, records: the sounds identified as American Indians show tonal fluctuations and absence of repetitions useful for coding. After phonological analysis, it is considered that the structure is incompatible with known cryptographic logic. Recommendation: suspend efforts on this front. It was the confession that the technological war had come up against the limit of culture, that the Japanese, masters of miniaturization engineering, had been defeated by a system that existed only in the memory of men who, until recently, did not even have the right to vote in their own country. This paradigm collapse has not gone unnoticed in academic circles. After the war, German, British, and even Soviet scholars began to revise their doctrines of electronic warfare. They realized that the obsession with machines had overshadowed the understanding of language as a human phenomenon. Cryptography, until then a field restricted to mathematics, would need to open up to anthropology, ethnolinguistics, and cultural psychology. War, after all, is not just a contest of arms, but of worldviews. In retrospect, the Navajo Code was not only efficient, he was revolutionary. It showed that, in a world dominated by cables, valves, and frequencies, the greatest innovation could come from morality. That language, when shaped by necessity and tradition, can be more precise than any cipher. That the voice, trained in silence, can overcome the noise of all machines. And that revolution, discreet, invisible but devastating, was about to find its defining moment. A field of ashes, a hill overrun with blood, and a battle where eyes were not enough. The world was about to hear the force of a language that refused to die. In 1944, the island of Saipan became a brutal, calculating ground. The uneven terrain, dense jungle, and tunnels dug by the Japanese turned each advance into a deadly lottery. It was there that the United States Marines faced not only the visible enemy, but time. Every second of delay in a request for air support could mean dozens of deaths. And it was precisely in this scenario that the Navajo Code revealed its most lethal advantage: speed. On one documented occasion, troops of the 2nd Marine Division were trapped between two fortified hills. Enemy fire came from hidden machine guns and camouflaged artillery. There was no line of sight to the aircraft. A Navajo operator, whose name for protocol reasons has never been released, received the position by radio and transmitted the coordinates to the command in just 18 seconds. 4 minutes later, a squadron of F-6F Hellcats executed a precision bombardment that neutralized the Japanese positions. No messages were intercepted. No order was understood by the enemy. Only silence, followed by explosion. In Guam, the Navajo Code was used to coordinate the evacuation of an entire battalion in the midst of an ambush. In less than 2 minutes, the orders were transmitted, confirmed, and initiated. There was no repetition. There was no delay. The Japanese, when they picked up the transmission, heard sounds that once again revealed nothing. They sounded like tribal chants, disconnected noises, and while they were trying to interpret, the battalion had already repositioned itself. Later reports indicate that without that communication, At least 200 men would have been surrounded and annihilated. The Navajo Code didn't just save lives. He anticipated the death of the enemy. The same pattern repeated itself on Peleliu, where treacherous topography and kamikaze resistance required tactical decisions on the fly. One of the most critical moments of the operation involved the need to redirect artillery fire from one sector to another, less than 3 minutes apart. The cables were cut. Conventional radios congested. 2 Navajo operators coordinated the attack with just 3 sentences, transmitted and understood in less than 30 seconds. The result? The artillery moved with millimeter precision, preventing the Japanese advance and sealing the American victory in that stretch of the island. In Okinawa, the scenario was even more dramatic. Under heavy rain and suicide attacks, the Marines had to cross a minefield before dawn. Any error, any delay, any intercepted communication could compromise the entire mission. 3 Navajo code talkers worked in continuous relays for 36 hours. They relayed more than 600 messages, coordinating supplies, mine location, troop redeployment, and medical evacuation calls. There was no failure. There was no useful interception. A report from the 6th Marine Division ends with a short and definitive sentence. Without them, we wouldn't cross. That is the central point of this part of the story. It is not just a matter of technical admiration. This is an irreversible tactical consequence. The presence of the code talkers changed the pace of the war. It made the American machine faster, more accurate, and above all, more invulnerable. For the Japanese, war became a guessing game, while the Americans operated with full vision. The Japanese doctrine, which previously bet on the domain of information, became irrelevant. With each battle won without interceptions, a layer of trust evaporated among Japanese officers. And behind the scenes, a whispered confession grew. The enemy had invented something that not even death could stop, because language was now a living entity. Not coincidentally, at a secret meeting of the Japanese General Staff, Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, then Prime Minister, was told that American tactical communications had become unbreakable. His comment was dry. This is not a code. It's a ritual. And on this point he was more right than he imagined, because every Navajo message carried not just coordinates, but centuries of adaptation, survival, and cultural resistance. It was the invisible weight of the indigenous past being projected onto the military future of the United States. While Japan produced manuals and simulated responses with tactical mock-ups, the U.S. put operators in the center of the fire, relying on their voices more than they would trust any machine. The Navajo Code didn't need technical updating. It updated itself with the soldiers' experience. With each battle, the language evolved. With each message, confidence grew. And with each failed interception attempt, Japan moved away from victory. It is at this point in history that a rarely discussed fact emerges. Estimates from the U.S. Department of Defense suggest that, thanks to the speed and inviolability of the Navajo Code, more than 12,000 lives were preserved in the South Pacific campaigns alone. This number does not only involve saved soldiers but also civilians, combat medics, logistics operators. The entire supply chain and decision has become more agile, because when the message arrived in seconds, the answer came in minutes, and the enemy didn't even know where the attack began. And yet, even in the face of so much evidence, Japanese officials, and to a lesser extent Germans, maintained their doctrinal arrogance. They continued to try to turn war into algorithms, ignoring that the American response came from human, improvised, ancestral mathematics. By this time, the war was no longer about who had the most tanks. It was about who could hear and respond the fastest. And the Navajos spoke with the precision of centuries. But there was one last German attempt afoot, a front that believed it had finally detected a flaw, a repetition, a sequence, a fragment that might reveal the code. What they found, however, was not a breach. It was a mirror. And what they saw there would forever change their understanding of the power of language. In September 1945, when the rubble of war was still smoking and the Japanese surrender was already formally signed, a new kind of silent battle began, not on the battlefield but in the interrogation rooms. Japanese military intelligence officers, now prisoners, began to be confronted with facts that, until then, had seemed inconceivable. Among them, a specific revelation would cause a disproportionate impact. The existence of a code that has never been broken, created not by mathematicians, but by native shepherds, transmitted not by machines, but by voices. When the first documents about the Navajo code talkers were presented, many officials simply laughed. They thought it was American disinformation. For them, it was more credible to assume that the code was the result of a secret machine than to imagine that it was based on an oral language of an indigenous people. But as the interrogations progressed and the technical reports were cross-referenced with operational transcripts, the truth was imposed. The reaction was incredulity, followed by shame. Naval Intelligence Commander Mitsuo Yamazaki stated, "It doesn't make sense. It was like magic. There was no standard, and even then, it was militarily functional." The biggest shock came from the fact that for years, the entire Japanese espionage structure revolved around the assumption that all code had a logical foundation. The Navajo code, however, didn't just escape logic, he subverted her. Declassified documents decades later reveal that in private meetings, Japanese academics from the University of Tokyo, recruited during the war to analyze tribal transmissions, expressed feelings of intellectual humiliation. Professor Takanori Fujita, one of the linguists who worked on intercepted recordings, confessed to his colleagues, "What I thought was primitive noise was actually a more sophisticated language than any phonetic cipher we studied. We were not prepared to think outside our axis." This confession echoed in other sectors. Navy officials, accustomed to treating interception as an exact science, admitted to completely underestimating American cultural diversity. An internal ground force report even recorded that the United States won the war not only by industry, but by the plurality of its soldiers. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them all along, picked up by their radios, repeated in their archives, discussed in their listening centers, and yet incomprehensible. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can bring you more in-depth content and reveal other forgotten stories that changed the course of the war. The final blow to Japanese self-confidence came with the fact that the Navajo program remained classified for more than 2 decades after the war ended. During that time, even most of the coders themselves could not speak of their participation. The silence imposed by the American armed forces contributed to the myth. When finally, in 1968, the documents were partially released, the Japanese press treated the subject with almost spiritual astonishment. Headlines in newspapers such as the Asahi Shimbun used terms such as invisible code and the ghost tongue. For a culture that values clarity, technical mastery, and control over variables, discovering that they had been defeated by something invisible, immeasurable, and oral was an unspoken but profound trauma. The impact also hit the Germans. Although Germany had not directly confronted the Navajo coders, Abwehr intelligence had, in 1943, recorded sound anomalies in American communications, but classified them as internal dialects of low priority. After the war, upon discovering the true nature of that code, many officers of the old German intelligence revised their analyses. Karl Stengel, a former Luftwaffe cryptographer, declared at a conference in Basel, "The mistake was not technical, it was cultural. We were programmed to decipher the Western, the rational. We never thought that America would resort to what it itself marginalized. It was the admission that they lost, not because of lack of equipment, but because of excessive arrogance. The U.S. government, for its part, treated the revelation with the same secrecy that characterized the entire program. The intention was clear, to preserve a strategic reserve. The Navajo Code, while effective, was not infinite. The operators were aging, and their training required more than instruction. It required inheritance. Many speakers of the original language were disappearing. By 1942, the Navajo language was spoken by about 70,000 people. By 1968, that number had fallen by half. The paradox was cruel. The safest code in history was also one of the most culturally fragile. The post-war revelation not only shattered myths about Japanese and German technical supremacy, it shed light on the greatest irony of World War II. The most industrialized country, with the greatest logistical capacity in history, won a critical part of the conflict thanks to a culture that it itself had pursued for decades. The Navajo, who were forbidden to speak their language in schools, who were forced to forget their tribal names, became the guardians of the war's deadliest message. And his enemies, so obsessed with algorithms, never imagined that they would lose to stories told around campfires. But the story was not yet over. An unexpected event, which took place in an interrogation room in Yokohama, would put a symbolic end to this whole plot. A Japanese general, upon first hearing the recording of an original Navajo transmission, did not respond with analysis or denial. He just took off his glasses, looked at the floor, and whispered 3 words that have never been forgotten. When the dust of war settled, and the spotlight of American victory turned to parades, speeches, and treaties, the men who had won unseen quietly returned to their lands. None of them wore medals. None could tell what they had done. They were veterans, but invisible. They were heroes, but unknown. The Navajo coders returned to a nation that, even saved by their voices, still did not recognize them as full citizens. Some returned to poverty-stricken reserves. Others found schools that still forbade the teaching of the language that had defeated Imperial Japan. For many, the return was not peace. It was silence. The same silence they had learned to master on the battlefields now became a prison in everyday life. Chester Nez, one of the original 29, worked in a small market in New Mexico. His neighbor never knew that this man, slow-spoken and sunken eyes, had helped coordinate one of the most accurate offensives in military history. Samuel Sandoval, another operator, said that when he applied for a job, he was asked if he had experience with radio, and he said no, because legally he could not yet tell what he knew. For more than 20 years, the existence of the program remained classified, and with that, its participants were condemned to live as if nothing had happened. The contradiction was glaring. While generals discoursed on the importance of American technology, men who had carried code more efficient than any machine were relegated to anonymity. Some went back to being pastors, others mechanics. Some sank into alcoholism. Many carried nameless traumas, not just because of what they saw in the war, but because they knew that the most important part of their lives had to be forgotten. One of the coders even said, "The war was difficult, but more difficult was pretending that I was never there." It is at this point in history that the technical dimension gives way to the human dimension. The genius of the Navajo code did not lie only in its structure. It was in the mind that created it, in the body that sustained it, in the soul that transmitted it. Each operator was a living archive, a link between 2 wars. The war fought with weapons and the war fought with identity. Because before they were soldiers, they were survivors of an educational system that tried to eradicate their culture. As children, they were forced to forget their language. As adults, they were called upon to use it to save lives. The irony could not be greater. What was labeled as primitive became the vanguard of military intelligence. What was forbidden became a tool of salvation. Those who were silenced became messengers of victory. But when the war ended, marginalization remained. Even in the 60s and 70s, when part of the story began to surface, recognition was slow. The first medals only came decades later. The U.S. Congress did not formalize public thanks until 2000, 55 years after the end of the war. During that time, most of the operators had already left. They died of natural causes, many in anonymity, some buried in simple cemeteries, far from Washington's monumental memorials. Their names rarely appeared in school books. Their voices, which had carried artillery coordinates and evacuation orders, were swallowed up in oblivion. And yet, each transmission of theirs was an act of resistance, because to communicate is to survive. To communicate is to exist. And for these men, who grew up hearing that their language was useless, turning it into code was also an affirmation of dignity. They proved that what had been labeled inferior was actually impenetrable, that what the military manuals ignored was precisely what would protect them. They carried on their lips a language that described mountains, rivers, winds, and spirits, and with it, they redrew the front lines. A U.S. Department of Defense report published in 1992 formally acknowledged that no messages encoded in Navajo were deciphered during World War II. A short, objective sentence, but one that holds a story of silence, suffering, and invisible glory. Because behind this inviolability were men who were never trained to be soldiers. They were called to be legends, and they fulfilled the mission without ever asking for recognition. The question that remains is simple. How did such a powerful nation need to resort to the culture that it itself tried to erase? And the answer lies precisely in this complexity. The United States won the war not only with tanks and planes. They won because, in a time of need, they allowed the diversity they tried to suppress to emerge as a force. The Navajo Code was not a miracle. It was a reminder that the most advanced civilizations are not the ones that build the most weapons, but the ones that hear the most voices. Even today, there are fewer than 10 Navajo code talkers alive. Most can no longer speak at length. Their memories are fragmented, their words slower, but each one carries the weight of a mission accomplished. Each voice is a story capsule, each silence a victory. And among all the messages conveyed in the Pacific War, perhaps the most symbolic is the one that has never been picked up by enemies. The message that even forgotten peoples have in their language the strength to change the world. But there was still one last battle to be fought, not in the military field, but in the field of memory. Because the true legacy of these men would only be complete when the whole world knew what they did, and why we will never forget it. It took 23 years for America to recognize what it had in its hands during the war. In 1968, the Navajo's Code Talkers program was officially declassified. Secrecy, which had protected the code during the war, had now become a moral obstacle. For more than 2 decades, the men who had saved entire battles could not speak of their deeds, and the nation they helped protect could not thank them. The disqualification was the first step to correct this omission. The following year, in 1969, the U.S. Navy organized a small reconnaissance ceremony. There was no parade, no crowds, just a discreet ceremony in the Navajo Reserve, with a few Marines, 3 retired generals, and the veterans who were still alive. For the first time, their names were said in public, not as a registration number, but as part of a history that the country was slowly beginning to remember. The speeches were restrained, but loaded with regret. A Navy colonel present at the event stated, "Our mistake was one of timing, but not of gratitude." For the coders, however, recognition still sounded distant. Many were sick. Others had already died. Their families watched the tribute with a mixture of pride and regret. The feeling was clear. It was fair, but it was too late. Still, this first gesture paved the way for a rewriting of American historical memory. Schools have begun to include the Navajo program in their curricula. History books began to cite his achievements. Documentaries were produced, interviews recorded, names rescued. For the first time, America looked inward and saw, in the voice that won the war, a reflection of the diversity it had tried so hard to suppress. In the 80s and 90s, the movement for recognition grew. Veterans associations lobbied Congress. Military museums have created unique exhibits on the coders. And in 2001, finally, came the most important symbolic moment. The United States Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the original 29 Navajo coders. It was the highest American civilian decoration, presented by a sitting president, in a solemn ceremony at the Capitol. George W. Bush, in his official speech, declared, "Today we honor the courage of men who have not only served the homeland, they have served the truth. You have turned a tongue into a weapon, and with it, they protected an entire nation." The image of that ceremony went around the world. Old, white-haired men with slow steps received the medals with moist eyes and trembling hands. Some carried photos of their comrades who could not live until that day. Others were in wheelchairs supported by grandchildren who were only now discovering the dimension of their grandparents' history. One of them, upon receiving his medal, said only one sentence, "Now my tongue can live in peace." It was more than a thank you. It was a declaration of victory. The presentation of the gold medal represented a reckoning, not just with the coders, but with the entire Navajo people. Because by honoring these men, America also recognized that it had erred, that he had tried to erase the culture that, in the end, saved his military integrity. Schools on Indian reservations began to teach the native language again. Universities began to offer linguistics courses aimed at preserving the language. The Department of Defense itself has funded projects to document the original code as a form of historical record and symbolic reparation. More than a decoration, that gesture rewrote history. For the first time, the language of war was not just about guns, but about words. For the first time, America learned that its greatest asset was not in the machines, but in the diversity that endured within it. And with that, justice, albeit late, began to manifest itself. The impact of this revaluation was felt on other fronts. Other tribes began to claim recognition for their contributions. Indigenous language programs received more support. And in 2008, Congress declared August 14th National Navajo Code Decipher Day, celebrated annually in public ceremonies across the country. The memory, however, was still being built. Each year, fewer coders remained alive. In 2014, there were only 5 left. In 2020, 2. The last official ceremony attended by an operator took place in 2021. He didn't say much. He only repeated, on the microphone, the first message he had transmitted on Guadalcanal, as if closing a cycle. The war, after all, had ended a long time ago. But the battle for memory is longer. And that's why telling this story matters. It is not just about justice. It is about identity. To recognize that the strength of a nation is also in its forgotten voices. That a country is not powerful because it has tanks, but because it can see value in what it previously ignored. The saga of the Navajo Code Talkers is not a separate chapter. It is the moral center of a war that was won not only with bombs, but with dignity. And if there is a definitive lesson in this story, it is this. The real strength is in listening to what they have always tried to silence. But even with all this recognition, one question remained behind the scenes in Washington. A newly discovered document, dated 1943, indicated that the Japanese were closer than previously thought to making a critical discovery, but they retreated. Why? The answer lay in an unlikely decision, made by a field agent in Tokyo, and that decision would, unbeknownst to him, change the fate of the entire war in the Pacific. Today, when digital security experts debate the limits of post-quantum cryptography, there is still an indisputable example of a code that has never been broken, and that did not even need an algorithm. The Navajo code, built on an ancestral language, transmitted exclusively by memory and speech, remains to this day as a unique case of perfect encryption. No machine has deciphered it. No enemy even came close to understanding him. Neither the brutality of war, nor statistical analysis, nor the technological power of Japan could penetrate its logic. And this raises an uncomfortable question for technologists today. How can a language, forged by centuries of oral tradition, be more effective than the best cryptographic formulas of World War II? The answer lies in what the Japanese, and the world, have ignored for a long time. Culture is also technology. Human diversity, often treated as a logistical obstacle or strategic noise, can be, in the right hands, the most powerful tool of war. The Navajo Code was the synthesis of this. A complex, changeable, resistant system, based not on circuits but on living symbols, loaded with history, spirituality, and relationship with the land. Each operator was at once a soldier and guardian of a worldview, and that made it impossible to imitate, copy, or break. That's why, even today, the U.S. National Security Agency, NSA, is still studying the conceptual model behind the code as an example of organic cryptography. In a confidential report released in part in the 2000s, one analyst says, "The human factor here is not vulnerability, it's strength, because the code does not exist outside the operator's body. It lives while the operator breathes." No current technology has this quality. Computers can be hacked, software decompiled, data stolen, but a code that resides in the identity of a people, that is inviolable. Therefore, the Navajo legacy defies the logic of the great military powers to this day. It's not just about using a language. It's about understanding that language is also an architecture of thought. The coders didn't just use the Navajo language. They thought with him, and that put them out of reach of the enemies. Because to break this code, it would be necessary to do more than decipher sounds. It would be necessary to understand the world as the Navajos do, in cycles, in relationships, in non-binary symbols. And no machine can do that. That is why the episode remains not only a historical reference, but a philosophical one. It forces the technical West to reconsider what it means by intelligence and security. It shows that the best solutions are not always born from the largest laboratories, but can emerge from marginalized histories, from oppressed cultures, from knowledge considered inferior, In 2022, Stanford University published a study pointing to the Navajo Code as the most successful application of linguistic cryptography in modern history. The study proposes that cybersecurity programs open up to exploit minority language patterns, not as eccentricity, but as a tactical advantage. The Pentagon is quietly already funding similar initiatives. Groups of linguists work with native African Austronesian languages, trying to find structures that escape the predictable logical patterns of traditional cryptography. The echo of the past still reverberates in the laboratories of the present, but the biggest lesson may not be in tactics. It is in ethics. The Navajo Code is proof that what an empire tries to destroy may one day save it. And that true superiority is not to dominate everything. It is to listen to what has been ignored for so long. If America understood this late, the world is still in time. Because in the future, not only those with the most drones, data or detection will win. Those who know how to integrate technology and humanity, science and culture, precision and compassion will win. And if there's one definitive legacy of the Navajo Code, it's this: the recognition that no machine will surpass the value of a truly loaded voice. But before this story ends, there is one last fact to be revealed. A number that remained hidden for almost 60 years. A total recorded on paper, kept secret, and that when it finally came to light, forever changed the way the real impact of this invisible operation is understood. In the end, the collapse of Japanese cryptographic doctrine was not caused by lack of effort, but by an excess of certainty. An empire that prided itself on translating Western machines, calculating British codes, and anticipating American attacks, succumbed to voices that came not from Harvard but from the Arizona reserves. The Navajo Code didn't just hold up, it completely ignored the enemy's logic. While the Japanese built machines to decipher patterns, the Americans trained men to create the unpredictable. The collapse was not only technical, it was moral. A culture that despised the invisible lost out to what it refused to see. And so, the thesis of this documentary proves itself with surgical precision. The industrial strength of the U.S. was not only in the factories that produced 1,000 tanks a month, but in the voices that could change a battle in 15 seconds. The war was won by steel, yes, but directed by something more powerful: people. And at this point, the lesson is universal. Every war is won not only by the one who shoots, but by the one who communicates better. Logistics decides the pace. Communication decides the time. And time, when used well, becomes a lethal weapon. The Navajo Code proved that cultural diversity can be the highest form of engineering. A code that was born of pain, exclusion, and resistance became, ironically, the most sophisticated cog in a machine that no one could stop. It wasn't a trick. It was a principle: to trust the human, not just the machine. And perhaps for this reason, at the end of the war, when the data came to light, the most bitter confession came not from the Japanese, but from a German officer captured at Nuremberg. Upon hearing about the complexity of American operations, he summed up the war in one sentence: "We didn't lose to bombs. We lost to radios and trucks." If you value historical research and revealing forgotten facts, support this channel with your like and your subscription. Comment below what was the most shocking data for you on this journey, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next devastating historical fact. Because there are still stories that deserve to be told accurately and with respect. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.